Hello, I'm Isabella Pereira, a trustee at the Social Research Association and a research director at Ipsos Mori. For those of you who are new to us, the Social Research Association is the membership organisation for social researchers in the UK, Ireland and beyond, and our mission is to promote excellence in social research through training, events and building a community for social researchers. I'm delighted to welcome you to this event to mark the publication of the first ever research exploring diversity and inclusion across the social research profession. This feels like a landmark moment for those of us who have been trying to determine a way forward on these issues for many years now, on the basis of anecdotes, hunches, and also personal experience. At the SRA, we knew that as social researchers, we could do much better than that. And we were delighted when we were able to appoint the Young Foundation last year to conduct some thoroughgoing evidence collection, and also when we secured the support of our sponsors, Power to Change and Kantar Public. We were also delighted by the response to our call to participate in the research. Nearly 1,000 researchers responded, clearly demonstrating the importance of this issue to so many of you. So this is an exciting moment when we can start to consider exactly what needs to change in the profession and how we can do that. We have a wonderful panel today to talk about the research, beginning with Victoria Bowman from the Young Foundation, who will first present findings from the research. After Victoria has spoken, there'll be time for a couple of clarification or technical questions, so please do share any such questions with us using the Q&A function in Zoom. We then have a panel of discussants who will each reflect for around 5 minutes on the findings. Sam Friedman, Assistant Professor at LSE's Department of Sociology and a member of the Social Mobility Commission, whose work on socio-economic background and career progression in the civil service was published earlier this year. Liz Bewley, Head of Strategy for Government Social Research, Craig Watkins, Chief Executive of Kantar Public in the UK, Edward Walden, Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Manager at Power to Change, and Babita Earle, Chair of the Market Research Society's recently established and thriving Diversity and Inclusion and Equality Council. This first part of the event, the presentations and reflections, will be recorded and will then be followed by around 20 minutes to cover your questions to the whole panel. So please do share your questions for the end of the event using the Q&A function, which the whole panel will also be able to see. We won't be able to cover all of the questions, unfortunately, but given we've got such a great panel with us, I'll be prioritising broader questions that can be put to the whole group. And also, if you would like to, you can ask a question anonymously. So I'll now hand over to Victoria Bowman from the Young Foundation, who's going to tell us about the research findings.
Thank you, Isabella. I'm just going to try and perform the screen sharing magic. So hopefully you can now all see my screen. And it's really great to see so many people here today and interested in this research. Oh, I've got a technical problem here. Okay, there we go. So we were really excited to be able to work with the SRA on this important research, and we set out together 4 main aims for the study: to explore perceptions of diversity and inclusion in the profession, the experiences of social researchers, the perceptions and experiences of diversity and inclusion initiatives that people have been exposed to, and the barriers and enablers to making progress. We covered a huge amount of ground in our research, but nonetheless, inevitably, we were still not able to explore every topic or issue in the depth that we would have liked. It also means that I can only share with you today a snapshot of the headline findings, so please do make sure to download and read a copy of the full report after this webinar. It's on both the SRA and the Young Foundation websites now. Just to give you a little bit of context in terms of what we did and who we spoke to, we were absolutely delighted that almost 1,000 people who identify social researchers took part in an online survey. And as you can see here, they came from all walks of life, and they work across academia, the public sector, in commercial firms, and in third sector organisations and think tanks. And some are also self-employed freelance researchers as well. there is no research which tells us who works as a social researcher in the UK. So we don't know how representative this sample is of the profession as a whole. However, we do believe that the diversity of those who took part does mean that we are able to shed meaningful light on a broad spectrum of experiences and views. And we supplemented that survey with some in-depth interviews with both social researchers and some representatives of research organisations and commissioners across the different sectors. As I'm sure everyone here knows, there are a range of ways in which we could have analysed this data, but we decided to focus primarily on an intersectional approach, as we felt this was the lens which best reflected nuance and complexity of people's identities and their lived experience. And this is something that people told us themselves as well in those depth interviews. We also recognise there are lots of debates around how to best describe and categorise in this kind of research, and the subtleties and the nuance in between, whether we're talking about minorities or minoritized groups or marginalized or disadvantaged, and the kind of issues around each of those pieces of terminology. We've primarily chosen to use marginalized here, but there are instances in which we will use other terms. And you'll find, again, more detail on the experiences of different groups, for example, by ethnic background or by gender and health status and so on, in the main report. So I'm going to start off with just a couple of headlines about sort of people's perceptions of the overall state of the profession. Sorry, subtitles. There we go. First of all, overall, there is a strong perception that the profession could do better in terms of how representative it is of wider society and the extent to which diversity and inclusion are valued and how research is funded and designed. The profession itself is not felt to be particularly diverse, and in particular, the representation of people from ethnic minority groups at all levels of organisations is severely lacking. More needs to be done to retain, to improve access in the first place and to retain talent as people progress in their careers. And routes to becoming a social researcher, people told us, can be really challenging and quite opaque, and it's not even always seen as a first destination profession. And then when you layer on top of that the kind of exclusionary and discriminatory behaviour that can also limit the progression of researchers, and a lack of representation at senior levels, these things are both reflections and causes of the problem. Alongside this, there is this perception that the way in which social research is funded and designed must be made more inclusive. Inclusive practice often gets squeezed out because of timing, money, or other resourcing issues, or because not enough perspectives have been involved in the design of the brief or the subsequent design of the research. And so this is something that a lot of people feel quite strongly needs to be addressed. Turning now to the lived experience of social researchers, this was the core focus of the study, where we kind of captured most data. Overall, unfortunately, but perhaps not that surprisingly, the picture is not particularly positive. As we will see, social researchers from marginalised groups tend to have quite negative experiences of working in the profession. And it's clear that, despite often good intentions, the profession does struggle to include and accommodate for a diversity of identities, backgrounds, and circumstances. Indeed, 20% of people told us that they don't feel equality, diversity, and inclusion issues are taken seriously enough within the profession. Fundamentally, researchers' experiences are shaped by workplace cultures. And in general, around 3/4 of social researchers do feel they belong and are supported at work. So while this is broadly positive, what we see, and you'll see this over and again in the next few slides, is that those who identify as having two or more of these marginalized characteristics, as we've called them, they report experiencing a significantly less supportive and inclusive workplace culture on every indicator. And they tell us that, feelings of inclusion are really tied to those ideas of difference. And with those from minority background, often reporting a sense of imposter syndrome. And it's also clear that there's lots to be done in terms of valuing the unique attributes and characteristics and experiences that people can bring to their work. Work-life balance is another area where there's definitely room for improvement. And, the culture of the profession is often typified as being very fast-paced and very high pressure. And often, particularly for those working in more qualitatively focused roles, with a significant requirement for sort of outside of traditional hours working. And so whilst around 2/3 of social workers say they are satisfied with their work-life balance, this falls to just over half in academia and the commercial sector. And we also saw that experiences of this intersect, particularly with people's personal circumstances, and that, for example, parents and carers in particular often find it hardest to achieve a healthy work-life balance. Perhaps the most depressing finding of this research, though, is the evidence of just how widespread discriminatory and exclusionary behaviours are in the workplace. Almost 3/4 of researchers have experienced at least one type of discriminatory or exclusionary behaviour in the last 3 years. And of these, 1/4 have experienced 5 or more. And again, as you can see, the more marginalised parts of your identity that you identify with, the more likely it is that you will have experienced more of these incidents. And on top of this, a similar proportion reports having witnessed at least one type of discriminatory or exclusionary behaviour that felt unfair or unequal. And so overall, we've got 83% of people saying that they have either personally experienced or witnessed at least one of these behaviours within the last 3 years. The most common instance are those which we are typically known, I guess, as microaggressions. Those experiences which people told us can often be really quite hard to pin down and point out as directly discriminatory, but which recur repeatedly and which create a culture in which they feel really undervalued or uncomfortable. And many of those we spoke with described how these behaviours have a cumulative effect, and their subtlety makes it really difficult to respond to and escalate. And when you're in that situation, it can really lead to self-doubt. And if it's met with ambivalence or dismissal from colleagues, it becomes even more undermining as an experience. And once again, you can see that that kind of pattern of behaviour increases with how many marginalised characteristics someone identifies with. Unsurprisingly, these negative experiences can have really profound effects on people. They chip away at individuals' self-esteem and their self-confidence and contribute to negative well-being and mental health outcomes. These also have broader impacts on people's motivation and their productivity in the workplace and how well they simply feel able to contribute to the research processes that they're part of. And moreover, as a result, it shapes people's career paths, and more than 1/4 of people told us they've considered leaving their job because of concerns related to diversity and inclusion. And when we spoke to those who were already self-employed, over half told us that issues of diversity and inclusion had contributed to that decision. What this means is that in turn, that's further limiting diversity in the profession, particularly in more senior roles, as people gradually leave the profession. So how are we responding as a profession? Only 1/3 of those who have experienced or witnessed inappropriate behaviour at work raised it with senior leaders or HR. Now, among those who didn't, 40% said they didn't feel it was the most appropriate way to deal with the incident, and another 11% said that they didn't feel it was their place to do so. But for the rest, it largely reflects a perception that escalation processes are inadequate, and that's particularly the case for dealing with the most common types of discrimination around those more subtle and more indirect types of microaggression. Many people are fearful of how reporting incidents will be responded to within their organisation, and there's a bit of a lack of trust often in HR and senior leaders to deal with those situations appropriately. And this is perhaps reflected in the fact that of those who did raise concerns, only around 1/4 felt that it was resolved to their satisfaction. Crucially, for those who take it upon themselves to make change within their organisation, they told us how burdensome and undermining that process can be. And it really highlights some quite important questions about where the responsibility lies for making change, both within organisations and within the profession as a whole. One area where things do seem to be more broadly positive, perhaps, is in terms of how mental health support is perceived, and employers are generally, when asked of everybody, deemed to be supportive, although there is recognition that more needs to be done to reduce the stigma around mental health within the profession and create working cultures that support good mental health. of which work-life balance is one important part that people spoke about. However, those who have experience of mental ill health report significantly poorer outcomes and experiences of the workplace than those who do not. So it is actually a much more complicated picture for those people who have lived experience of that issue. Finally, I want to turn briefly to perceptions of diversity and inclusion initiatives. You'll see here that we've plotted the proportion of people who've experienced an issue against people's perceived effectiveness of that issue. And the most effective initiatives are those which empower marginalised groups, so mentoring, coaching and leadership programmes, and initiatives which cater to people's specific needs, so flexible working and making reasonable adjustments in the workplace. However, the least effective initiatives can often feel like tick box exercises or quick wins. And it's often to do with the way they have been implemented within an organisation, but they're frequently criticised as being insincere attempts to be seen to be doing the right thing rather than genuine attempts to effect change. So, for example, unconscious bias training and gender pay gap reviews were both highlighted as actions which can form an important starting point and an important basis for an organisation's work, but are really widely felt to be insufficient to generate any real change on their own. And I guess so what's striking here is the gap between some of the initiatives which are most common and which most people have had experience of or seen in their organisations and those which are most effective. And so there needs to be a real effort to kind of close that gap and look at this more critically. People told us that initiatives work best when they really authentically reflect and account for the lived experiences of marginalised groups. And it's really important to give staff power to influence the diversity and inclusion activity of an organisation. So whether that's through things like staff networks or working groups, task forces. But that alone, again, only goes so far. And there's a real importance to emphasise that, that buy-in from senior leaders must drive this change, both in terms of making sure that the time and the resources and that kind of cultural leadership is there to model and invest in the change that needs to be made. With this in mind, we asked people to rank the top 3 areas which they feel need to be prioritised for action within the profession. And 2 issues really stand out. First of all is the need to continue to address the discrimination and exclusion of people from minority ethnic backgrounds. And secondly, the need to tackle the perceived elitist nature of the profession. Our report contains a series of recommendations that speak to everyone within the social research ecosystem. There's actions for all of us to take, those of us who are researchers, senior leaders in organisations, funders, commissioners of research. And we believe there's a real need for much better collaboration across this kind of slightly amorphous profession that is social research. We hope you'll take the time to read the findings in detail and that together we can make some improvements to the way in which we're working to make this profession more diverse, more inclusive, more representative of society and a more attractive place for people to come and work. But I'm not going to go through all of our recommendations now because we have a really stellar panel coming up who are going to share their reflections.
Thank you so much, Victoria. I couldn't agree more with your final sentiments there. I'm just checking in on any questions that we've had. As I mentioned, there's time for any technical questions that you have for Victoria, but I've only just got one about whether the recording of this is going to be available at the end, which it will be. It'll be available on the SRA website. And of course, the report as well, the Young Foundation's excellent report is also available on our website too. So I'm going to move straight on into hearing from our discussants. And I'd like to start by introducing Sam Friedman. So Sam, if I can hand over to you for 5 minutes, please.
Thanks so much, Isabella. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for asking me to read and respond to this fascinating report. I thought it was great. And I particularly like the way the methodology allowed you to show the compounding or cumulative disadvantages faced by people at the intersection of various marginalised categories, characteristics. particularly in terms of their lived experience of the profession. I think this is particularly important in the current climate, where we have a government that seems intent on unhelpfully presenting intersectionality as some sort of inequality top trumps, particularly in terms of playing class off against race. I think really useful, just sort of in the way that you present the research, trying to counteract that narrative. I also appreciate the way the report integrated aspects of diversity and inclusion, often overlooked, I think, or certainly in my experience, things like neurodiversity and religion. But I suppose I'm obviously best placed to respond to the report in terms of the area I know best, which is class and socioeconomic diversity. So I'll devote most of my comments to that. And here initially, I have to say I was a bit surprised that class or socioeconomic background was not included as one of your marginalised characteristics. Perhaps we can pick up on that in the questions. But having said that, the report subsequently is then full of interesting and important insights in terms of this area. For example, you do actually record data on two key measures of socioeconomic background, people's own schooling and also their parental education. And here you reveal that social researchers are significantly more advantaged than the UK population. 14% of researchers who took part in the study were privately educated. That's compared to 7% in the population. And 40% are first in their family to go to university, whereas in the national population, that's 67%. I was also interested and concerned to see that in terms of perceptions of fairness in career progression in the sector, your respondents were particularly concerned about class barriers. Only 24% of your respondents believed that people have equal opportunities regardless of class to progress. And I think in that regard, I should say these findings very much chime with my own work, which has shown powerful kind of class ceiling effects in a range of Britain's professions, most recently the civil service, but also academia, which obviously there's some crossover here. I find that in looking at nationally representative data, academia is both dominated by those from privileged backgrounds in general, but also that academics from working class backgrounds tend to earn significantly less than their privileged colleagues, even when they're otherwise similar in terms of experience, hours worked, training, etc. And so the combination of that data and your findings, I think, are quite concerning, not just in terms of inequalities in life outcomes, but I thought also in terms of thinking about the role that social researchers play in framing the social world, right? As well as the way in which their kind of positionality or as researchers affect the type of findings they generate. Here, clearly, I think we need the research sector to better represent the socioeconomic spectrum of the societies that we study. So moving forward, I suppose my main message would be that I think your report points to the importance of the sector starting to properly take class background and socioeconomic diversity much more seriously. Indeed, as Victoria mentioned, your respondents squarely see this as a real priority, second only to race and ethnicity as the key D&I priority for the sector. I suppose I would suggest that you might do this as a sector in three key areas. I think first, properly nailing measurement. I think I could see in the methodology of this report something that I notice a lot, which is a sort of tentativeness about how to properly measure and monitor this in this area. And I think, here I would point to the guidance that's being provided by the Social Mobility Commission on their website, socialmobilityworks.org, that outlines the key questions to ask, such as the ones that I mentioned that are used in this report, but also parental occupation and a person's own self-assessment of their socioeconomic origin. It also provides information on how to ask those questions and how to benchmark the data to nationally representative findings. Second, to then use that data to look at how the class origins of social researchers intersect with other marginalised characteristics. I think those intersections are much more complicated than popularly thought and need to be teased out in organisational settings, but also whether those from working class backgrounds, as I mentioned, in social research organisations are facing these kind of class ceilings. Do they reach those top positions? And very finally, I just wanted to highlight that I think a really key task for the sector is to further interrogate something Victoria didn't mention in her presentation, but that is really fascinatingly in the report, which is the importance of this idea of what they call in the report mold, or what I would call fit, right? In terms of who gets ahead in social research. What are the dominant behavioral codes that predominate in social research? For example, just thinking about something like the self-presentational performance of intellect or expertise that we all know is often key to the research world and how people present themselves and their findings. How might these types of performances be misrecognized as forms of merit, and at the same time tilt unfairly in favor of those from privileged backgrounds, very often also in terms of white able-bodied men? Those would be the areas that I would really highlight moving forward. Thanks so much for the report. I really enjoyed it.
Hi, so I think we're moving on to me now. So I'm Liz Bewley. Nice to meet everyone virtually, and thank you for inviting me. I mean, when I was reading through the report, I felt really almost kind of excited in some ways, disappointed in others, but actually excited about it, because it's really great to see the momentum sort of going in the same direction across our sector, and it's going to be vital to really capitalise on that now to really make a difference. And I think one thing that's always bothered me about diversity and inclusion, well, there's probably many things, but one of the things is that it can sometimes end up as being an add-on topic. So there's been times in my career where it feels like an afterthought rather than being a sort of centre of focus. And for me, diversity and inclusion is really a thread that runs through everything that we do. And I was delighted to hear about this work and then read the report, as it's really placing diversity and inclusion front and centre. And it also reassured me in terms of the thinking within the government social research profession and the priorities and actions that we've set out on our own diversity and inclusion strategy for the next 4 years. So, key points for us has been around improving their diversity in social research, along with thinking more about how to improve access to our profession, so within government, but also, as this report shows, across the broader social research community. And I think the point around qualification requirements sort of to enter the social research sector really stuck out for me, and this is something we're thinking about in GSR, so kind of alternative entry routes. Because it does feel wrong that the only way individuals can come into this profession is through a degree or through people who are able to afford to do a degree. And it would be good to see opportunities for people to learn on the job, for example. I noted the point around how initiatives often haven't made the difference that's needed. Often feels like a lot of lip service. And I think there's been a lot of discussion over the years. And now, for me, particularly after reading this report, it's really important to sort of move to operationalising that and really implementing sort of those real tangible actions that are actually going to make a difference. And we need to really commit to saying that, we're going to do X, Y, and Z, but really thinking about those tangible outcomes and understanding how best we can get there, by speaking to our community and also our potential community of people who are, are interested in coming into this profession, to really understand, what it is that we can be doing and the kind of barriers and the challenges that people are facing. And I think, again, another point, there's a few points that resonated with me, but, one of the points about that diversity and inclusion being everyone's responsibility really, really resonated with me. It isn't the responsibility of the few, and those people shouldn't feel that it is just their responsibility. We're all in this together, and we should all be trying to really put it at the top. And, we need to work together to ensure diversity and inclusion is at the forefront in order to achieve the positive, inclusive working culture and sector that we aspire to. With those diverse views, the approaches and ideas, and surely that's what makes social research so rich, and that's what we're all about: understanding people and trying to show how rich our society is. And we know that changing cultures and sort of general change can be difficult, but one thing we definitely know about change is that you have to involve people, and particularly those people who will be affected by those changes, or who are struggling and need some kind of help in there. So collaboration and involvement is really essential. And it was really great to see that, again, highlighted within this report. And I think there was another aspect. So within GSR, our diversity and inclusion strategy has been developed by our members. So we had multiple working groups thinking about what we wanted to do, and it was a real purposeful decision to empower our community to really influence the aims and direction for our profession. And it's been really successful in engaging and starting to develop a culture where diversity and inclusion is at the core. And we've also been encouraging greater sharing of knowledge and experience through developing focused diversity and inclusion communities of practice, where, this is even just within government, where representatives from across all different departments are coming together to review and support each other in initiatives and interventions that we could probably put in place. And I think there is something about trying to get that collaboration. We talk about collaboration, but often it isn't quite that easy unless you know somebody almost who can help with that collaboration and make those connections. So it's really great to kind of hear about that in the report, and to kind of then for me to see that happening within GSR. And like I said, it is everyone's responsibility. Highlighted in the report again, but we need those senior leaders. We need our senior leaders to really step up and lead the way on this. We should all be held to account on delivering positive outcomes in this area, individually, through others, and across the whole social research sector. I'll just end on just saying that I think it's great to see this research bringing together the social research community, and I'm really hopeful about the future of a more diverse and inclusive profession across all sectors. So over to the next panel member.
Thank you, Liz. I think that's me. And like Sam and Liz, I'm delighted to have been asked to be part of the panel today, and delighted that we could support the work of this research. The report is fascinating, and for the first time kind of giving us an insight into the issue of diversity and inclusion in our profession. And just giving some reflections for myself as a senior leader in a commercial organisation, it makes sobering reading. There is there's a lot of insight that's provided by this. I particularly like, as Sam mentioned, the fact that we're able to see some of the issues of intersectionality coming out, which I think we can often be blind to. And it's really important that we understand that and the cumulative impact. And there are many common themes that came out in the report that I recognise from discussions and kind of data from within my own organisation, such as Liz mentioned, and Victoria mentioned in her presentation, the visibility of the profession as a career and the barriers that we have in place with qualifications for people actually accessing it. And so we can change all the processes that we like, but if actually people that we are targeting or want to kind of bring into the profession to increase our diversity don't know we exist, don't see us as a career, that causes us an issue. And some of the work that we're taking forward within Kantar Public is around how do we outreach, how do we remove those barriers about having to be a graduate, bringing in apprenticeships, making sure that we are trying to be as visible as possible to the widest population, because we can't best serve our clients or society at large or our teams if we don't look like the population and we don't have that diversity and representation that we can then bring into our thinking and into our work. I mean, it's absolutely critical. We're a profession that says we want to understand people, we want to understand the richness of people and in all its diversity, so that we can have the data that enables us to make better decisions, to have a beneficial impact on society. And yet it's evident from this report that we are not representative, we are not diverse, and that people aren't having the experience that we need them to do. So it's particularly important, I think, for us as a profession to do the job that we want to do, to be able to kind of fix that. Another point coming out kind of really strongly for me was around the need to understand people's lived experience and to involve members from across your organisation in those discussions. No one of us has all of the answers, and it has certainly been a kind of a really important learning experience for me to speak to members from across my team to understand their experiences. Because I have my experience, but that will be different from theirs. We only know what we know. And so involving members of our team and our organization in helping to create the solutions and helping to understand where we have these issues is absolutely key. And as I said, I found it really enlightening around understanding the cumulative impact of intersectionality of characteristics. Yes, it's everybody's responsibility. Yes, everybody needs to commit. And it is absolutely unfair and inappropriate to lay the solutions of this issue at the feet of those who happen to be in marginalized communities or in minorities, because as I think as kind of came through in several comments and discussions I've had personally, it's incredibly wearing for individuals who find themselves in that position. It is not their job to educate the rest of us. And that is something that we need to find a way through, because obviously it's important to involve people and understand their experiences, but we also need to remove the burden of that off individuals, which is critical. And I very much do see it as my responsibility and my commitment to my organization to provide the resources, to provide the drive, to provide the vision around how we fix this. And the last point from me, one of which it was interesting seeing the priorities come out, because they were exactly the same that came out of discussions within my organisation of ethnic diversity, socioeconomic status. So that was a good data point in that there was that kind of there was that linkage. But lastly, around the point that came out several times around the inclusivity of research. And as I mentioned, we can't, as a profession, we can't hope to be fully inclusive in our work if we are not inclusive in how we look. And so that issue, I think, is going to become more important as we have the challenge of commissioners' funding and budgets being under pressure as a result of the pandemic, and how we ensure that we protect and do better at the inclusivity of the research that we design and deliver going forward. So thank you for listening, and I'll hand over now to Ed.
Hello, thank you very much for that. Very interesting to hear the views of the other panelists. And as you get towards the end of the panel, you run the risk of saying the same things. So all I can say is I agree with a lot of those. I also wanted to give a brief introduction to Power to Change for some of you who may not know us. So we were one of the funders of this piece of research, and we're a charitably endowed funder. And we have a focus on community businesses, which is social enterprises that return profit to their local community and when they're accountable also to the local community. So that's where we're sort of bringing our reflections to this from. We funded it particularly because we've had a research institute for the first 5 years that's given us a very clear commitment to evidence and research. We believe that the good quality data supports the community sector, and we use that data to lead the work that we do. And we also recognise that a huge amount of the policy that affects communities relies upon data and insights created by social researchers. And I'd agree with some of the sentiment that came out earlier, which was if the social research profession isn't open and inclusive and it doesn't represent the people that is being researched, there's a danger that the quality of the output won't be as good as it could have been for those communities. This is true of all of the professions that work within the third sector. We as grant makers, the people that we pay to do capacity building for the grantees, it's true all the way down. If we want to better serve these communities, we have to be diverse, equitable and inclusive. Otherwise, we aren't doing as good a job as they deserve for us. They deserve. The number of responses at 1,000, I think, was really fantastic. It really shows that people care about this work. And as somebody mentioned earlier, I think it was Isabella, is enough to draw conclusions from. And I think that's true. I think it's a fantastic amount. And I think broadly, it shows that the social research profession has a long way to go. But again, that's true of as I said, many different organisations in the sector. I work within the foundation space, and it's foundations as well. We're having discussions about how we can do DEI work in an effective way. And much in the same way as the research found, employers are making steps, but staff, and particularly those with lived experience of marginalisation, say that there's more to do. So I'd say don't be disheartened by those things, by the fact that there are those challenges and there's the work still to do. It's true of all of us. The elements of the report that I found particularly touched upon the work that Power to Change has been doing, or particularly reflective on our experience, is one of the quotes was that disabled people aren't welcome in social research because as researchers, we research them rather than being part of research. And I think this reflects a lot of my own experience, having worked in disability rights organisations over the last 10 years. And there's a motto within that sector of nothing about us without us, which is that reflects the risk of marginalised groups being seen as beneficiaries and being stripped of agency, which is a huge problem. As soon as they're sort of seen as needing to be done to rather than done with, you diminish their ability to act for themselves. What we're trying to do to address this is we're moving towards valuing lived experience across all forms of marginalisation as being seen as a skill. It's useful experience in its own right, because it helps people understand how to work within those communities, reflect the needs of those communities in ways that people without that lived experience don't have. And if we can really elevate lived experience to having value, then it will be something that can also be seen by people who have no lived experience of marginalisation as having value to drive them towards becoming better allies and be sort of becoming more informed on those issues themselves. I also wanted to reflect on the significant differences between the sectors. So there was a part talking about public sector social researchers say they're more likely to feel positively, whereas third sector organisations thought that there was more to do. They disagreed. And I think that that's reflective a lot of what we're seeing in the community business sector, charity sector, foundation sector in which we work. Foundations think that they're doing things that are beneficial and people will broadly agree. But when it comes down to looking at the views of those who have their sort of feet on the ground, as it were, being closer to the action or having lived experience of marginalisation, they think that there is more to do. And so I just wanted to highlight that I think as the group who thinks we're doing well, we have a responsibility to listen to those voices. We have to believe them when they say that there's a critical need and that there's more to do. Our responsibility extends into us taking actions on the back of that. And that leads into one of the elements I found really interesting, which was a quote talking about, we want to sample by effectiveness rather than by representativeness. And I think there's a real interplay between those two things, because we're seeing similar things in the way that we assess grant making processes. If we ask and we get back 90% positive feedback for how easy our application processes were, if all of the 10% of organisations who disagreed, who found it traumatic, who found that it was complicated and exclusionary, if they all share particular characteristics or shared experience of marginalisation, if we only focus on the good feedback of the 90%, we're compounding the marginalisation of the 10%. We can sort of look at the big picture in the wrong way. And I would agree that we need to sample by effectiveness. We need to design for the people who are most experiencing harm. And then my final point, I think I still have time, is the bits about microaggressions. Some of this was really difficult to read about the experiences that people have faced of discrimination. But one of the reflections that I had specifically about microaggressions being met with ambivalence, people will respond to being called out for microaggressions defensively. They may elaborate on their meaning or their intent or try to rationalize or to diminish the impact. And one of the quotes in the research was, it's harmless, it's just a bit of banter. And you do see that a lot working in the DEI space. And one of the reactions I found most useful to that is that you don't get to choose how other people feel. If somebody is reflecting to you that what you've said is harmful or is traumatic or complicated, even in a smaller way than you might expect of discrimination, you just have to believe them. You don't get to say, oh, well, you shouldn't have felt that for this, or my intent was that. It's not the appropriate response. And one of the pieces that I found most useful for that, if anybody has heard of the book or not, I recommend it. It's called White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo, because her view is that if someone is calling you out for being ableist or racist or discriminatory or performing a microaggression or whatever it is, they're giving you a gift. And that gift is an opportunity to better who you are, to build on their experience and internalize their reflections. And the reason that it's a gift is because they're essentially complimenting you. They believe that you can do better. They're taking a risk to speak out in a situation where often, calling out discrimination, calling out microaggressions is punished. They're taking a risk because they see the value in you becoming a better person, in learning more about why what you're doing is problematic or traumatic and moving past it. And so I really can't advocate for that kind of mindset enough. I can't say I'm there myself, but the book is excellent. And the way that it lays out that response to receiving guidance from those who experience marginalization as a gift and a compliment is a really healthy way to do that. And I think it's excellent. I'm not sure who we're moving on to next because they haven't popped up on my screen.
It's myself, it's Babita. Hi. Isabella, I'm just wanting to do a time check as well. Am I okay to go to 5 minutes or did you want me to?
Yeah, you're absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Fine. Okay, cool. Hello, everybody. And yes, thank you to Isabella and Graham for inviting me to this session. So I'm Beta. I wear many hats. So I chair the DE&I Council for MRS. I'm also part of the advisory board for women in research in our industry. And my day job, I work for the other sector. So I work for a tech startup platform in the market research industry. So, but I did start my career at the ONS as a statistician. I stayed for a couple of years, but then I switched sectors. So I'm just going to cover 2 or 3 things. And I saw Marie-Claude is here. She's asking questions. And she obviously ran the market research equivalent piece of research for us. So I just want to give my personal reflections, draw some parallels to the study that we did with the MRS, where we saw some differences, but then really focus on what we're doing now in action, because I think that's the most important thing. And that's really where my head goes to. Because when I read this report on Sunday morning, I had a mixture of emotions. First, I was angry, then I was sad. Then I thought, well, what did I expect to see, right? And as far as I'm concerned, it's not good enough, right? The results that we're seeing are not good enough. What we're seeing is 2/3 of people within the industry actually don't see it as an inclusive and diverse place to be. And that simply isn't good enough when that comes down to individuals' lived experiences. And a lot of the panelists have already said that the kind of services that we provide and the work that we do, which influences policy making, legislation, it's critical that we sort this out, because it has an impact on the kind of decisions that people make. It's a flywheel, right? If we've got biases, if we're not diverse enough ourselves, the work that we produce is not going to be good enough, and then it perpetuates. So looking at ourselves as an industry first and looking at some of these figures and saying, actually, what do we need to be working towards is a critical question. So yes, this gives us a benchmark. Yes, it's exciting, but actually they're not great results. How does this compare to the MRS survey that we ran, and that was last year? There are some very clear parallels. We saw very similar results in the number of people feeling the industry was inclusive. I think over 2/3 again felt that it wasn't. We saw similar amount of people, I think it was about 30% saying they left the industry and became consultants because they had an issue of D&I and it just didn't felt that they belonged. The issues became much more pronounced when you went into minority groups, marginalised groups, people from ethnic minorities. 10% actually felt that the industry was diverse. And I know, looking at the report, you get similar sort of numbers there. High degree of witness cases of harassment and discrimination. I see that it's pretty high in your report as well. There was some light. Your report and the MRS report says that the LGBTQ community feel much more positive about their lived experiences, and we related that directly to, and a big part to, the MRS Pride organisation, which has been set up for 2 years now, and those sorts of communities have a real impact on how people feel and where their voices are heard within organisations. Things that I didn't see as much, and maybe it was reflected in the profile of your responses, was the younger set of respondents just felt much more passionate in the MRS study about doing something about this. We wanted to learn more, wanted to educate more, and be better allies. There's what I saw in this report, which I didn't see there, it was this disconnect and this real skepticism around what organisations are doing, whether actually people are feeling the impact of those initiatives, and this element of tokenism. And maybe it could be because of timing, because, you know, there's a real rise of corporate consciousness, a real rise of organisational consciousness around the George Floyd incidents. A lot of it could have been down to tokenism. Has that faded away? Have those initiatives really taken an impact? And the reliance on volunteers and the reliance on actually marginalised communities to actually make the difference, it just is not, it's just not cutting it. High problem of belonging, I see more so in your results. And I think Sam talked about this right at the beginning around the whole element of social ceilings, social inclusion. This, I saw a comment in the report around middle-class gatekeepers, the Oxbridge effect. It feels so much more pronounced. And I think we as an industry as a whole have a job to do in making ourselves understood, being much more inclusive, and making ourselves much more accessible to future talent that aren't from the Oxbridge background, because ultimately that will make us a better industry and help us serve people in a better way. So what should it be that we do? You know, what are the things that the MRS is doing? What are the things that we do in the council that we could say would be useful here? For me, I think it's about starting at the top. And this was mentioned already. Where does ultimate accountability for this has to be, right? And it has to be at the leadership level of our organizations. You know, we have boards. There's somebody that looks after marketing. We have somebody that looks after operations. Do we have somebody that looks after this issue? Because we're saying it's important, but do we have somebody that is 100% looking after this? And I know where I've seen this, it works. And this is why with the council, one of our core pillars is driving signatures to the Inclusion Pledge, because that clearly states accountability at the top within those organizations to really driving improvements in DE&I. And that requires investment, right, in terms of people's time. We rely too much on volunteers. We rely too much on interest groups. And that's great. You know, it gives people a voice, but it's exhausting. So there needs to be some proper accountability, and we need to set some goals, whether they're cultural change goals in terms of where we're moving towards. I think the other area is about how do we attract talent? How do we present our industry to parts of community that we're not understood? My parents don't understand what I do. And we're not inclusive of those communities. And actually, when we do attract talent from more diverse communities, are we set up to help them succeed? So things that we're doing with the D&I Council, we've set up partnerships with the 10,000 Black interns. If there's an apprenticeship program, we're looking at different partnerships. That means that when we go to recruit, we say, oh, we just can't get more women, or we just can't get more Black people. We can. We just need to be more creative, and we need to have the system set up to help more people that are not Oxbridge, not white, middle-class men to succeed. So that it means that we need to change how we talk about ourselves. And I think there's a lot here about wholesale change. What Penny landed with me this year was the whole concept of allyship. What the MRS results showed is that older white men don't get it, but we have to have them on board if we're going to succeed overall. So we're looking at a range of allyship programs. How do we support people that are fearful of talking about this, that just don't get it, to get it? And then there are a lot of interest groups out there. There's MRS Pride, there's CORE. We've just set up a group called Unlimited, which is around representing the interests of, sorry, Isabella, we do need to find out, Unlimited interests of neurodiversity. And then there's a social inclusion group being set up. So I'm sorry, I went on a bit longer, but as you can see, I'm really passionate. There's a lot that we should do and there's a lot that can be done. So I'll finish.
Okay. Sorry to cut you short slightly, Babita. I wonder if we could go back into the panel, please, so we can bring the whole group back together. Is that okay? And sort of move then into question and answers. Brilliant. Okay, so I've got a couple of really quick technical questions which I'm going to fire at Victoria that have come through. And Victoria, I know you've seen them, questions about how we've dealt with social, or how the Young Foundation have dealt with social class in the report, and also intersectionality.
Yeah, so just to speak briefly to those points, we very much recognise that the approach to intersectionality isn't perfect, but what we did want to do was to really reflect the fact that it is intersectionality that is important to a lot of people. And when we were speaking to people in depth, they were telling us, this happened to me, but I don't know whether it's because I'm young, because I'm female, or because I'm black. So I don't really know what the cause, or which part of my identity it is that's triggering these behaviours. And what we wanted to reflect very much is, what's really clear in the data is actually that the more intersections you have within your identity, quite clearly, the more challenging your experience is as a social researcher. And so we felt that was really important to put across. And we also really wanted to avoid that kind of possibility of top trumps, I think Sam called it at the start, between, on this indicator, one group performs worse than the other. It also allows us to address some of the issues around kind of correlations, where some things are very correlated, for example, with being a woman or a carer. In how do you unpick those two things meaningfully? And so that also then speaks to the point about social class. So we did have those indicators in there that Sam mentioned around first generation university and educational background, but being a first generation university student correlated so heavily with age. Participation in higher education has just gone up so massively that whether it's a true indicator of kind of social class or even of social mobility felt quite questionable at that point. And so we chose to really focus on the qualitative insights that we were getting, both in the open-ended answers to the survey and through the interviews on that topic.
The SRA are planning a number of further discussion panels to cover a number of other issues. We're going to talk about race and ethnicity with the support of social researchers of colour. With the support of Ella Fryer-Smith, we're going to have another session on social class. These are going to be happening in the autumn. And it sounds like from the brilliant questions that so many of you asked that there could be opportunities for further panel discussions too. And we've got a number of questions about inclusiveness in research budgets, participatory practices. I think that would be a fantastic discussion for the SRA to be working on. So that's something that, there will be more following up. But as we're coming up to the end of this event, it sadly remains for me to just thank our panelists really for their brilliant contributions and their time. Thank you so much, all of you, for attending and for supporting this research. We really, really appreciate it. The report is now available on our website and also on the Young Foundation's website, of course. And if you'd like to find out more about the Social Research Association or become a member, you'll also see some information on our website and I think in the chat as well. So yes, final reminder, this is the first of several events that are planned in the year to follow up on this research, and we really hope to see you all at another event. So thank you very, very much.